from the heart of Dubai. This is Sports Unhinged with Mohammed Hamiz.
And we are on. Welcome to Sports Unhinged. My name is Mohammed Hamiz, and thanks for being here with us on this third episode of your favorite sports podcast. I have to admit, before we get going, there's a bit of a white lie going on over here. We're not really coming to you from the heart of Dubai today. Actually in the middle of a vacation right now in Valencia, Spain, and I can't wait for tomorrow where we get to go and see the first game of the season for Valencia playing against Las Palmas. So really excited about that. But what a beginning of a season that we've had in the Premier League. We've already had some fantastic games happening. Real Madrid versus Barcelona is where we're going to start today and talk about the Super Cup that has just concluded with Real Madrid emphatically winning that matchup. We're also going to be talking a little bit about some NFL and some NBA to wrap the show up. So fasten your seatbelts and buckle up. We've got a very exciting show ahead of us today. Now let's start with the football. Real Madrid versus Barcelona. First leg 3-1, second leg 2-0, ended up as a 5-1 aggregate win for Real Madrid. And it hasn't been short of controversy, it hasn't been short of events and exciting goals out there. We've seen Cristiano Ronaldo get sent off minutes after scoring a goal, kind of sticking it back to the Barcelona fans with the shirt celebration that Messi did last year. Got a yellow card for taking his shirt off, and moments later, which was debatably seen as a dive, got the second yellow card and got sent off. Now, I have no issue with Cristiano Ronaldo getting sent off. I do have an issue with him touching the referee. It is debatable. I mean, I looked at the Suarez penalty and I looked at the Ronaldo penalty, and it's very debatable. You could always argue that Suarez's penalty was actually a dive and that Ronaldo lost control and fell. What made it probably bookable is the fact that when he fell, he didn't get straight back up and he waved to the referee for a penalty. And at that point of time, the referee has to decide, do I give him a penalty or do I book him for diving? So it is debatable. But one thing that you cannot debate is that you cannot put your hands on a referee. And that's where the 5-game suspension that Ronaldo got was absolutely warranted. Before the decision came out, however, I was reading a lot of articles that were saying that he might be out for 12 games. That would have been excessive. I think 5 is reasonable. It sends a message that you simply cannot put your hands on the referee. But let's talk about the game here. Let's talk about what's happening. I'm not going to go into the specifics of the games and the goals. I'm sure you've all seen it. What I want to touch on here a little bit is that it seems that Barcelona and Real Madrid have essentially swapped policies here. Barcelona's past glories were down to a core of academy products and young players that were fused with a few key signings. And I'm not saying that Barcelona's never made expensive signings, they have, but the core of the team has always come from the youth academy. Real Madrid, on the other hand, were the ones that were always chasing the Galacticos. They were always going for those big money buys, trying to conquer markets for t-shirt sales and the business side of it. We've seen the Zidane signing, the Ronaldo R9, the David Beckham. We're seeing something a bit different here. Now Real Madrid have all of Spain's best youngsters. You have Isco, Asensio. I mean, Asensio is just an unbelievable player. He has emphatically announced his arrival to the scene in the last 2 games. And he has scored on every competition debut that he has been part of. And I, for one, as a Spanish supporter, can't wait for the World Cup and seeing what Asensio will do with the national team. But you have Isco as well, who has been absolutely phenomenal in the last 2 games. Lucas Vázquez is there, Dani Ceballos is there. So we have quite a lot of youth that Real Madrid are kind of nurturing and bringing up through the systems, while Barcelona are chasing the big names. And even then, they're not very good at it. I mean, seriously, they have just signed Paulinho, who is a Spurs reject, for £40 million from a Chinese club. For 40 million. Juventus just signed Matuidi for half that price. Something does not make sense. This is absolute desperation from Barcelona. Paulinho has never played in the Champions League, and I just don't understand why they would put so much value on him. Also, they've messed up negotiations with Verratti, with Dembele, with Coutinho. So, as far as Barcelona is concerned right now, unless Messi gets really angry and goes on a tear, takes the club, puts it on his back, and goes on an absolute tear that is unprecedented, I think Real Madrid is going to dominate the Spanish football scene for a long time to come. Having said that, it's really the only game that excites people in Spanish football. In the Premier League, the English Premier League, however, we saw an incredible start to the season. We're going to review what we saw in that first week. And the reason why I'm going to go through it in a bit of detail is because last podcast I went through some predictions for the season. And I'm not one to gloat, but that first week made me look really, really good. It's early days still, but there's a lot that we can take out from the games that we saw in the first games of the season. But the word of the week for me is demeanor. A lot has been derived from the demeanor and the body language of teams out there. Manchester United, comfortable, organized, determined. Chelsea were apathetic. They were undisciplined. They seemed divided. Liverpool, defenseless, as we predicted last week. They were careless. There was a bit of tension there. Arsenal, chaotic, thrilling, hashtag Wenger in, Wenger out throughout the whole game. It was absolutely fantastic to watch. Manchester City, early days, they played against, not a great team, but they were blue collar. They were conservative and slightly boring, but they got the job done. However, last week when I talked about my prediction of Manchester United winning the league, a lot of you listeners out there kind of chuckled at me, and it was interesting having that feedback and talking to some of you that listened to the podcast last week. But when we saw the first day of the season, there was no opening day madness at Old Trafford. Unlike at Chelsea, there was also no controversy either, unlike at Arsenal. And again, of course it's early days. It's just the first game of the season. But what I saw is that Lukaku, just like Zlatan Ibrahimovic last season, seemed as though he's fit in well already at the team, and he's relishing the challenge of upping his game for Manchester United in their quest to win the Premier League and the Champions League this season. It also speaks volumes of a big squad, of a good squad, when they can bring on Fellaini and Lingard as substitutes. But on a cautionary note, I still feel that Manchester United need to make sure that Lukaku and Rashford remain injury-free if they are going to challenge for the Premier League title this season. But I think it was an absolutely fantastic display. Now, comparing them to Manchester City, which I kind of maybe a little bit exaggeratingly predicted that they will finish at fifth. But given that both City and United beat pretty much abysmal teams last week in West Ham and Brighton respectively, comparisons do seem reasonable. And based on this weekend, United, in my opinion, are going to stomp all over City. United were swift in the attack, whereas City were very ponderous. I know that everyone raves about David Silva and Kevin De Bruyne, and they are great players, but watching the game last week against Brighton, the number of negative passes that each of them made was truly mind-boggling. Instead of looking for the killer ball, they made those negative passes. A team can have all the possession in the world, but unless they actually get shots on goal, then it will do them no good at all. I mean, it's an obvious statement. Jose Mourinho showed or put out a very attacking-minded lineup. He put Lukaku, Mkhitaryan, Rashford, Mata, Pogba. He left Herrera on the bench. So I think we're in for a very exciting season with Manchester United. And if we compare the two games, Man United, Man City, City had 78% of the possession, and they only got 4 shots on goal. And it was pretty much, no action happening the whole game. It got a little bit boring. United, on the other hand, only had 55% of the possession, but they had 6 shots on goal. They always were attacking minded. They threatened the opposition the whole time. And those shots on goals are shots on target, by the way. But yeah, again, I see that Mourinho is he's viewed as a pragmatist, but I saw that he put out a very attacking-minded lineup, and I think we're in for a very exciting season for Manchester United. As for Chelsea, before I get into the game and how it went and the loss to Burnley, the 3-2 loss to Burnley at home, I think we have to talk about the Diego Costa situation. And that's because it's clearly having an effect on the whole team. And this is my view on the whole Diego Costa issue that's going on. I believe that what Diego Costa is doing is absolute nonsense. For him to play the victim. He pushed for a move back to Atletico 3 times last year. Every single time that he was away from the club, such as on international duty or there was a break, we always heard from Diego Costa talking about how he's trying to move back to Atletico, but things are not working out. His footballing ability is incredible, don't get me wrong. There's no question about that. His passion, his willingness to embrace the role of the villain, to play the bully and bully the defenders of the opposition, it's something that any team would want. And he's the kind of player, he's like the Sergio Ramos, the Diego Costas, the Gattusos back in the day. You hate playing against them, but you will never complain having them on your team. He's a great player. But I think in this particular situation, he got what he deserved. Because of that whole moving to China fiasco last January, I think that was the final straw. Antonio Conte begged him to stay last year. And he did. And he was fantastic for the first half of the season. He was absolutely incredible. But then he was terrible post-January. And he almost derailed Chelsea's amazing season. Before January 2017, from the beginning of the season, Costa scored 14 goals in the Premier League. After January 2007, after January 1st, he just scored 6 goals. He had 1 good game against Hull in 2017, but from then on, it was very obvious. There was no dedication, and it was very, very visible. Now, one thing I have to say, this whole system in football where players sign contracts that are seemingly binding for as long as they want them to be, I think that's very odd. If we look at professional baseball, American football, basketball, even ice hockey, when an athlete signs a 5-year contract, they are committed for 5 years. The idea that they might have their heads turned around after a year or two by someone who's willing to pay them more money is seen for what it is. It's seen as a breach of trust. And it simply doesn't happen because the player does not have leverage on where he moves. We're seeing that with Kyrie Irving in the NBA right now. He has put in a transfer request whilst under contract, and he does not have any leverage. He could be traded to the Phoenix Suns. He could be traded to the 76ers. He has absolutely no leverage on where he can go. But what we're seeing in football is a bit different. And what Diego Costa is doing right now is a very clear breach of trust. If a player wants to decide who they play with, then they play out their contracts and then they go and sign for whoever they want in the free agency market. Now in football, this is and I've talked about this in the last podcast. It's an underlying situation here that is causing hyperinflation in football. It's expanding the bubble of salaries and costs that are not just threatening the very fabric of the game, it is threatening the competition. It's given us an illusion of competition. And it's being driven by agents that are getting greedier and greedier for their share of the transfer fees. I mean, I don't know why a club would pander to players and their agents in this current system. I mean, how about this? Let's imagine if you had 2 choices of contracts when you're signing as a football player. Number 1, you have a choice of having a fixed term, which cannot be terminated by either side. And number 2, having an open-ended contract, which can be terminated by either side in, let's say, 4 weeks' notice. Tell me how many players would sign for option 2? None. Because it would mean that they will get fired and unemployed as soon as they get injured or lose form. That's why I think they need to honor their contracts. I mean, what happens if a team just says, no, you're not moving? These are all professional athletes getting paid very well to play a sport that they love. Are they really going to go out there and perform at less than their best when they know that doing that would basically reduce their value when their contracts eventually expire? So doing so is just what Diego Costa is doing is simply a display of unprofessional behavior. He's refusing to come back from Brazil because he knows that he'll be training with the reserves team. His refusal to come back and not being in shape right now is unprofessional. And this whole interview that he gave about him being treated as a criminal, I'm sorry, I have zero sympathy for him in this case. Now, sure, I would sulk a little bit too if I knew that someone was willing to pay me twice as much for the job that I'm already doing. But at some point, contracts have to be honored. It's like being married. You don't go around there right after the ceremony and start flirting with every attractive member of the opposite sex. Otherwise, the whole marriage and the institution of marriage and the ceremony and everything is pretty much pointless. It's the same thing with these contracts. Now, looking at the game, and I know it's still early days, but seeing Chelsea play against Burnley in that first week, and I know it's early days, but this reinforces the point that I made last week, which is this sheer idiocy of selling Matic to Manchester United. I fail to see how Chelsea have profited from the transfer, given that the money they received isn't really considered a stellar fee, especially in the post-Neymar to PSG era right now. More significantly, we saw immediately that Matic in Manchester United, it basically emboldened Chelsea's rival. It strengthened their team substantially. And Manchester United, in my opinion, would never sell a player to Chelsea, especially a player that might improve the team. But we've seen Chelsea do this perpetually. We've seen Chelsea sell Mata to Manchester United, Petr Cech to Arsenal, although Petr Cech this season is not looking great. But you have to wonder, what if Hazard goes to Manchester City in a year or two? What is the philosophy of Chelsea? And this is kind of making Antonio Conte very frustrated. And where there's smoke, there's fire. Antonio Conte is not happy. Last week, I mentioned that my opinion was that Conte is a rare breed of managers and that Chelsea should keep him for as long as they can. But to keep him, they need to make sure that he's happy. That means giving him the players that he's asking for. Yes, he spent 130 million on Morata, on Rudiger, on Bakayoko. But with all the players that they've loaned out, Chelsea have an unbelievable number of players that are loaned out. I think there are about 30, 35 right now. An unhappy manager, because he has a thin squad, that immediately turns the locker room into a toxic place. Then seeing the game against Burnley, the next issue that Chelsea have is discipline. Chelsea have played about 3 or 4 meaningful games since the end of last season. In each one of these games, there has been red cards. Tackles with open studs. And I didn't really... Some of the red cards are a bit harsh, but I think that they need to be given at some point in time. Just because Chelsea are the defending champions, they did not get that favorable treatment. Also, I saw that Batshuayi, Morata was started on the bench, and Batshuayi started up front, and he looked absolutely terrible. Completely static, immobile, no pressure on the defense. He's kind of a poor man's Ruud van Nistelrooy. He's trying to nick goals off chances, but he added very little to the team, didn't put any pressure on the defense, and didn't bring anyone into a play. He didn't create space. The minute Morata came on, however, he looked absolutely superb. Very aggressive, very up for it. And I think we're going to see a fantastic season from Morata. Chelsea have had a history of letting down their coaches, getting in their own way. They've let down Ancelotti after 2010. They've let down Jose Mourinho in 2012. And now they're doing it to Conte. Everybody knows, everybody can see that the squad is really thin. It needs investment. And if Antonio Conte goes, he won't be easy to replace with the same quality, believe me. And I read some articles out there that are suggesting that he started Morata on the bench because he wanted to field a weak team to send a message to the ownership, to Abramovich. I honestly don't think Antonio Conte is that kind of person. I think if he's that unhappy, he will just get up and leave. He wouldn't try to compromise. I mean, it's self-destructive behavior if that was the case. So I don't really buy into that. But I think that once Hazard comes back and they start Morata, obviously, you know, there are good signs that are coming up here for Chelsea. I think they'll be okay. Now, let's move on to Arsenal. What an opening game we had to the season. And for me, that game is an absolute perfect prediction for how the season will go for Arsenal. It was absolutely hilarious. We saw a goal coming in the first 2 minutes for Arsenal, Lacazette, Wenger in. 2 minutes later, there was an equalizer. Horrible defense. Wenger out. And I found myself, like probably most people watching the game, moving between Wenger in, Wenger out. In, out, shake it all about. And it's typical Arsenal. It's typical Arsenal. Sublime skill, and then in certain cases, hilarious incompetence. But I think there were a lot of, despite all of that, obviously they won the game, so there's been a lot of positives out there for Arsenal. First of all, Lacazette. What a classy player. Comes on, scores a goal within the first 2 minutes. Pressure is off right now. No one's waiting for him to score. He got that out of the way, the monkey off his back, and I think he's going to be a very good player. Also, we saw some good substitutions from Arsene Wenger. Ramsey's first touch was absolutely sublime for that goal. And obviously, this is exactly why we love super sub Olivier Giroud. He comes on, does what he does best, and I think he's the best super sub in the game. So well done to Wenger on that. Third of all, we saw Kolasinac, who continued to impress. He had a very good pre-season. Tough guy, good passing, nice vision. He wants to win. He's a competitor. And Arsenal needed that. They needed somebody with that kind of will. Fourth, we saw that there's a lot of firepower up front for Arsenal. And that's why they're going to score a lot of goals. A lot of attacking threat. And finally, we saw that grit, not giving up. You know, we saw at the tail end of last season that Arsenal were always coming back. They were fighting to the final whistle. And they didn't give up at 3-2 down. They fought hard, they played intelligently, they got back in it. And that's probably the most important takeaway for Arsenal. Now let's look at the negatives. Straight up, the defense was awful. And that was very obvious. I mean, of course, it's the first time that this back three have ever played together. And it's probably going to be the last, because when you play a back three format, the success of that format depends wholly on familiarity. We've seen Bonucci, Chiellini, Barzagli in the Italian national team and Juventus. It's the familiarity that gets that whole system to succeed. You need a partnership where the three defenders know what to expect from each other. It can't be cobbled up in a makeshift fashion, the way that Arsenal did it against Leicester. Also, I saw that Rob Holding, as talented as he is not consistent yet. I'm confident with Koscielny and Mustafi coming back and taking over with either Monreal or Kolasinac on the left, I think they'll be a lot better. But I would keep Rob Holding for now, playing in the Europa League and the Cups, the lower level opposition. Another negative that I saw from Arsenal was Petr Cech. He was really poor, and this is the season where he might lose his place to Ospina. Wenger made it very clear at the beginning of the season that with the depth that Arsenal has this season, that no one is safe. Cech was very clearly at fault for the first goal and was also very weirdly positioned for the third one. But at the end of the day, it was a good day for Arsenal. Let's not forget that Leicester is a very good side, and it wasn't luck that they won the league 2 seasons ago. So Vardy and Mahrez were at their usual excellent levels, and it was never going to be an easy win. Manchester City, I'm not going to go into it. It's still too early. They played against a terrible team. Away win, 3 points, clean sheets, no complaints. I said they were a little bit boring. They could have played more attacking football, but we'll keep it at that. With Liverpool, we predicted it last week. At this point, it's a dead season for Liverpool unless they can pull off a reliable central defender, a box-to-box midfielder, and they might as well donate Simon Mignolet to a Cambodian club before the transfer window is up, because his goalkeeping was absolutely terrible. The communication that he had between him and the defenders is absolutely poor. Lovren, I don't think, will improve much this season. Matip has regressed. And I said that last week, I like Liverpool because of their manager. Klopp has made them very likable. But, if they continue these erratic performances, I think it won't sit well with the fans, who have been very, very patient. Elsewhere, I think everybody was genuinely happy for Wayne Rooney to score the winner for Everton. Wayne Rooney might have won a ton of trophies with Manchester United, but this is the club that he supported as a boy, and it must have been a very good moment for him to get the winner. Next week, we have two interesting games to look out for. The two that I picked out are Tottenham versus Chelsea. We're going to get a lot of information from those two, from this game, and also Manchester City versus Everton. Everton, who just spent 40 million, is it? 50 million for Gylfi Sigurdsson. Again, it's the ridiculous age of the post-Neymar era, I guess. Post-Neymar to PSG era, but that's what we're dealing with right now. Anyways, you're listening to Sports Unhinged. When we come back, we're going to be talking a little bit about the NFL. Jay Cutler has been signed as the quarterback for the Miami Dolphins. Colin Kaepernick is back in the same story, and we've seen Marshawn Lynch and Michael Bennett sit during the national anthem. More on that when we come back.
You're listening to the Sports Unhinged podcast.
We're going to be talking about a little bit of NFL right now. Of course, we've all seen that Jay Cutler has signed for the Miami Dolphins, and that immediately started the usual outcry for Colin Kaepernick and how he still doesn't have a job in the NFL and how he's being blackballed for his national anthem protest from last year. But in this particular case, I completely disagree with this rage. Let's not forget, Colin Kaepernick came out wearing a Fidel Castro t-shirt not too long ago. And for those of you who didn't know, the city of Miami is 34 to 35% Cuban population. I mean, if Tom Brady, or let's pick a basketball player, let's pick Matthew Dellavedova, if he went into Harlem wearing a KKK hood, would anyone expect the Harlem Globetrotters to give him a job? Of course not. That, in essence, is what Kaepernick did to Miami with that Castro t-shirt. He glorified a man that tortured and murdered thousands of people directly connected to the community that supports the franchise. So say what you will about Colin Kaepernick being blackballed unjustifiably elsewhere in the NFL, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But that's a whole different argument when it comes to Miami. Colin Kaepernick created his own situation in the Miami market, and no one should have any complaints that he's not being hired over there. Now let's talk about Jay Cutler, and it's funny because when I heard that Jay Cutler signed, and I was preparing for this podcast, I actually came out with a lot of points to defend Jay Cutler. I was going to come out here and say that the Dolphins needed to get a reliable quarterback, because right now they have Matt Moore, who is very, very good. Not that far away from Jay Cutler, in my opinion. But at the same time, you need to have two quarterbacks. Jay Cutler, I was going to come out and say that Jay Cutler had one of the worst offensive lines in NFL history. When the Chicago Bears had a defense, they didn't have an offense. And when they gave him an offense that still had a lot of mental baggage and injury issues, they had no defense. And the special teams always fell apart. I was also going to come out here and say that Jay Cutler in Chicago had 7 offensive coordinators, 3 head coaches, 2 GMs, and a laundry list of injuries. I was also going to come out here and say that if they stuck with Matt Moore that they'll be giving up this season, because what happens if Matt Moore goes down? That $10 million that they gave Jay Cutler, had they given it to Jarvis Landry with no quarterback, it's no good. Who even gets them to 8 wins? Now, don't get me wrong, Matt Moore is a very good quarterback, and take this from a Panthers fan, because I thought that he was very solid when we had him. But I was going to come out here and say that Jay Cutler might have not had a fair shake in Chicago. After all, Chicago is a dysfunctional organization. They gave the Panthers Greg Olsen because he wasn't good enough. Look at him right now. He's one of the best tight ends in the game. But then I heard Jay Cutler say this.
You know, I've, like you said, the last 4 months I've been in a different mode, different mindset, getting ready for the Fox deal. And it was really, you know, pretty good with where I was in my life. You know, I was around the kids a lot and, you know, felt pretty content. So weighed back and forth on this. I mean, I'd probably say my wife, Kristen, probably talked me into it more than anybody else could.
Jeff, what kind of blanket are you in on how long you think it's going to take?
Well, the good thing is I play quarterback, so I don't really have to be in that great of cardiovascular shape. But I'll be fine. You know, Adam knows kind of what I've been up to, so we'll figure it out along the way.
This isn't a guy that wants to play. And a lot of this talk happened during his time in Chicago, how he is not a motivator, he is not a leader. ESPN pretty much spends their time Cutler bashing more than anybody else that I've seen. But when a guy tells you that his wife had to talk him out of retirement, the fact that he does not have to be in good cardiovascular shape because he's a quarterback, if I'm a wide receiver, if I'm a player on that team, that's not the quarterback I want to play with. I don't care how good he is. I would rather risk it with Matt Moore and get another lower level quarterback as a backup that might come out and shine, or a rookie, than settle for this. Jay Cutler can bring that team down just from his demeanor. Word of the week, it's the demeanor. How do you motivate the players that you have? Now, we were lucky we got to see some preseason games, but those didn't go without any controversy either. We saw Marshawn Lynch and Michael Bennett sit down for the national anthem. Now, when it comes to Marshawn Lynch, he has told Jack Del Rio, his head coach, that he has been sitting for the national anthem for years. I personally cannot wait for somebody to go back and find me a compilation of Marshawn Lynch sitting through the national anthem, because if that is really true, then there's a question to be asked. Number one, how did he get away with it for that long? And number two, why is everybody causing an issue for calling Kaepernick? And why did Marshawn Lynch not get the same level of vitriol aimed towards him for sitting down? Now, Marshawn Lynch said that he's not doing this out of protest. It's just him being himself. Michael Bennett, on the other hand, did it out of protest. And there are a lot of layers to this. And I'm not going to go into a political discussion, but I think this needs to be said, especially with the events that we're seeing in Charlottesville right now in the US. I don't think that any NFL player can make an impact on the social discourse until the Pro Bowl and Super Bowl quarterbacks speak out and are standing behind the Michael Bennett's, the Colin Kaepernicks, the Marshawn Lynch's, if he's doing it out of protest. Where is Aaron Rodgers in this whole thing? Where's the comments from Aaron Rodgers, Drew Brees, Tom Brady, Russell Wilson even? What about great white players like J.J. Watt and Clay Matthews and Rob Gronkowski? Unless they come out and have something to say about these social issues, I don't think that anything will change. And, you know, I said I wouldn't get political, but the freedom of speech that is implemented in the US, that is usually lauded, it also allows for hate against a race. And there's a fine line between the criminality of this. Because you can't go and threaten someone's life in the US under the umbrella of free speech. That's considered a crime. That's breaking the law. But in this hate speech, we're seeing groups of people come out there, racist white supremacists, and they want a whole race to die or a bunch of races to die. In my opinion, there's no difference there. that is still criminal behavior. You're threatening someone's life. You can't change the mind of a racist, but what you can do is change the law to keep the racists at bay and keep them in their place. And a lot of people have been denouncing, obviously, what's happening in Charlottesville and making the point that somehow those guys, the racists, the white supremacists, are an isolated fringe anomaly in white America, which could be the case. But I think all of the sports pundits, the newscasters, they're missing one point. They're focusing on the fact that these guys are an anomaly. They are exception to the rule when it comes to white America, and they're completely ignoring the institutional racism and racist policies that are pretty much at the root of Kaepernick's protests. And those institutional policies are what are fueling the white supremacists' mindsets. Many also say that, Kaepernick's protest is still not valid because he hasn't proposed a solution to the systemic racism, the police corruption, the brutality that's there against the black community, the for-profit prison system, etc. There's a lot of issues that he brought to the limelight, but he hasn't suggested a solution, and people have been kind of maligning him for that. But we need to remember that Kaepernick is not a social policy engineer. What he's trying to do is bring these topics to discussion for the decision makers to be able to recognize and admit that there's a problem and then start devising the solutions. But how about we start with a fundamental agreement that the racism and discrimination is institutionalized? I mean, if we start there, then we can move on to the next steps and accepting that the very same white establishment, that is the NFL, is currently punishing Colin Kaepernick for using the platform to point out a verifiable fact of what's going on in the community. Once we get that out of the way when it comes to the Colin Kaepernick issue, then we can start talking about solutions all day. Now, like I said, that does not apply to Colin Kaepernick's situation when it comes to the Miami Dolphins, because he wore a Fidel Castro t-shirt. I mean, if Kaepernick was signed to the Miami Dolphins, he would be welcomed worse than Monica Lewinsky in a Clinton's Christmas dinner. Anyway, so that's what again, we go to sports to try to escape the ugliness of politics. But sometimes these two worlds intertwine. I didn't mean to go into a whole political soliloquy here, but that's our take on the situation right now when it comes to Colin Kaepernick. Now, next, before we wrap up, I wanted to quickly talk a little bit of NBA. And I want to talk about the LA Clippers because this might have kind of slipped under the radar, but Doc Rivers, who was the coach and general manager of the LA Clippers, has been relieved of his duties as the general manager of the LA Clippers. So he's only the coach right now. And I remember Chris Paul saying that, in Doc Rivers' first year, that the Clippers are not going to be Lob City anymore, that they're going to be going for championships. But what we saw, and there's two sides to this. I think that people have been going out of their way to criticize Doc Rivers as a coach, when in fact the criticism is only valid for him as a general manager. Because during his time there, so far as a general manager, we saw Blake Griffin go from a dominant post player to he's basically running off screens for 15-footers. They never got a scoring small forward. They kept their rim protector that they have to pull out every game because he can't throw free throws in DeAndre Jordan. And everybody and their mother knew that Chris Paul gets worn out by playoff times or injured. So Doc Rivers backed him up with his own son in Austin Rivers. And he traded away too many draft picks. So he was an absolutely horrible general manager. Because the Clippers were a scoring forward and a scoring center away from being the best team in the West at some point, when CP3 and Blake were at their primes. But year after year, they trotted the same crew out there expecting a different result. And that's what stopped the LA Clippers from reaching greatness, in my opinion. They kept doing the exact same thing and expecting different results. Einstein called that insanity. Who am I to disagree with Einstein, right? Now, Lawrence Frank has taken over as the general manager of the LA Clippers, and I think that that was not the greatest option either, especially when you have David Griffin and Chauncey Billups available out there. I think those would have been better options. But like I said, it's hard to buy into the criticism of Doc Rivers as a coach, especially when Chris Paul and Blake Griffin's injuries have derailed the team multiple times. As a coach, you have to play with what you have. And everybody praises Greg Popovich of San Antonio endlessly. But his job is a lot easier with players who could stay on the court. There's a balance to all of this, of course, but Paul and Griffin looked like pure gold a few seasons back. And now it's been clear to most that neither should have been considered franchise players. Chris Paul has gone to Houston right now. And sure, you can give Doc some blame for that, but let's not get carried away and take that blame into his coaching role. People still consider Chris Paul an all-time great. And most people consider Blake Griffin an all-star, who, in my opinion, isn't really great at anything. But you play with what's available to you. So this is the reality. But the LA Clippers, for the past few years, under Doc Rivers as a coach, have actually been relevant. And nobody wants to credit a team for staying good and relevant, when that's actually what keeps franchises alive and fan bases interested. Instead, it's about Doc's failure. I think that's kind of unfair. So it's great that Doc Rivers is only the coach. I believe that his strengths as a coach were his weaknesses as a GM. So now that the two roles are separated, let's see what the Clippers do. But of course, the damage is done with Chris Paul leaving. And now they're left with DeAndre Jordan and Blake Griffin and no real superstar player out there to take the helm. So I think that this decision came a little bit too late. But let's see. I still give Doc Rivers a lot of credit for being a good coach. And with that, we're going to wrap up our podcast. Thanks for listening again. It was always great. It's always great having you here. Please subscribe to our podcast on SoundCloud, www.soundcloud.com/Sports Unhinged. You can also find us on Facebook, facebook.com/Sports Unhinged. YouTube, you can search for our channel. You can find us on your iTunes, Apple Podcast app, and Stitcher apps. Thanks for joining us again. Again, we recorded this podcast from the summer vacation in a makeshift studio in Valencia, Spain. So hopefully next week we'll be back home in Dubai. We'll be covering the second week of the Premier League and a lot more news to come. Thank you for being with us and see you next week. Goodbye.